We're delighted to be coming to you from the Asia Pacific. I have two very important guests with me, Sharon Bagran-Rolls and Deb Kilroy. Before I begin, though, we start, as we always must, with a recognition of the land on which I meet here and Deb meets, and we also nod to where Sharon is joining us. I wish to acknowledge the elders of the land on which we meet and honour their leadership in this crucial time during this pandemic, and their First Nations wisdom that has helped guide us to some better insights about how to cooperate and to understand the kind of situation we've been in. And this session is really about human rights during the pandemic and in the recovery. And it has not been a very good time for human rights. And it's a time for us to reflect on how to balance issues like the right to health and other types of rights, and what happens when governments try to keep us safe. So one of the questions we'll be asking this afternoon is, whose security? So one of the issues we're thinking about now is how to create a post-COVID pathway to a more gender equal society. Is there a moment for transformation? We don't want to snap back. We want to snap forward into something better. We want to build back fairer. We want something different. So is there the potential for a transformative moment, and what can we learn about what happened to our human rights during the pandemic response? So that's what we're talking about now. I'm really delighted to introduce Sharon and Deb. So Sharon Bagran-Rolls joins us from Fiji today. She's a second-generation Fiji Island feminist working on the intersection of gender, media, communications and peace. She's speaking to us as the chairperson and gender liaison of the Board of Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. And she's also speaking on behalf of the Shifting Power Coalition. And then we're also going to speak to the equally fabulous Deborah Kilroy, an Order of Australia winner and a passionate advocate for justice. She's coming to us talking about Sisters Inside, which she founded, which advocates for the human rights of women in the criminal justice system and responds to gaps and services available to them. Both the biographies of our wonderful speakers here are on the WOW Global 24 website. So let's get straight into it. Sharon, I'm going to come to you first. So talk to us about your perceptions of what's been happening to women's security and women's rights in the region from your perspective.
Thanks, Susan. And hi, Deb. Great to be part of this conversation with you today. And a big shout out to all our sisters tuning in globally. It's great to be part of a really important global conversation. So thanks also, WOW, for this platform as well. You know, one of the things that we did as the Shifting the Power Coalition, which is an amazing feminist coalition, bringing together women-led organizations and women leaders, young women, women with disabilities across 6 Pacific Island countries, 13 organizations in collaboration with ActionAid Australia, was we did a rapid women's human security assessment. And I think that's really important in terms of the conversation we're having today, because yes, we wanted to know about their health situation, but in the lived realities of women where I come from here in the Pacific, like with many sisters across the globe, it's not just about our health security. It's about economic and food security. It's about community and personal security as we've seen as a result of the lockdowns in the pandemic. How safe are you in your own home, within your own family, and then within the broader community? And these assessments were done by women peace builders, by women with disabilities, by young women. And what was really important is this is an additional layer on top of a range of human security priorities that women have been talking about. And Susan, you and I, we've been interrogating the women's peace and security agenda for several decades now. And I just want to talk about in 2015, when we had the global study, one of our recommendations from the Pacific actually got 2 key references, which I think our leaders have failed to recognize. In UN Security Council Resolution 2242 of 2015, we got climate change in as a priority issue. And there is also a specific reference to the health pandemic. And so if you talk about the women, peace and security agenda, women peace builders from my part of the world have been saying these are our realities. So I think that's really important in terms of setting the scene. I think we then need to break it down a little bit more also from a feminist perspective to look at, well, we're not a heteronormative group of one size fits all women. So what has this meant for the security and safety of women in rural communities that live, 100 kilometers away from the nearest police station, let alone the nearest health center? What does this mean for women with disabilities who rely on caregivers, on personal assistance in this lockdown period? And what has it also meant in terms of the securitization of the response as well? So I think those are some of the key issues. On top of COVID-19, in the initial stages of the past few months, we've also been reminded of our climate security, our environmental security, because TC Harold came along and swept through Solomon Islands, swept through Fiji, battered Vanuatu, and then moved on to Tonga as well. So on top of these new challenges, suddenly women were also thinking about, how do I also organize and influence not just this space called the humanitarian response, but also the disaster management response as well. So these have been some of the issues that I think have been really important. And I guess my last point in terms of one's safety and security is also about one's access to information and communication. Is in our local languages, in our local context, and how do we also communicate in a way that, obviously, when you're feeling insecure, because nobody really thought about how big this pandemic was going to be, and there's a lot of fear that rural women who I was with last week on our second island of Fiji talked about their insecurities being just a lack of information and that kind of knowledge to help them not just prevent the spread of COVID-19, but also to protect their families and their communities as well. So, I think those are some key points for us to really think about as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you. There's so much in there, this idea of just securitized threats to things like pandemics help women's rights. Also the idea of, always thinking about whose security. What if the world reacted to domestic violence the way they've reacted to this pandemic? There's always other people's definitions of security at play, but also the response being an anathema to women's rights. If we think about the only solution is to lock yourself in with your potential perpetrator and abuser. There's some really horrific global statistics coming out, but also this issue about regional and remote communities. In Australia, there's been a practice of very serious restrictions around remote communities, mostly to protect, but whether that has had negative impacts on those communities as well is something that we're going to have to think about. But this idea too of the increased sense of militarization and restriction, police on the streets and police enforcing health, it's really interesting. And quite problematic. Some of my work's around women human rights defenders and around countries, nation states using the pandemic restrictions as an excuse to crack down on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, letting out certain types of prisoners but keeping political prisoners in jail where they're very vulnerable to COVID infection. A whole range of issues happening around the world, and a big test now will be, are we going to roll back some of these pandemic restrictions, or will governments find it convenient to keep some what should be extraordinary restrictions for longer because it might suit particular purposes? So we've got a lot of challenges ahead. But Deb, you've got some good news for a change. Some of your incredible hard work has paid off, and I'm delighted to hear this any kind of hope or progress that's come out of this time as well. So please tell us about your very important work around women who are incarcerated, the rights of prisoners generally, not just in Australia but globally, and please let us know what's been happening during the pandemic and what might come out the other side in your opinion.
Sure, thank you. And thanks, WOW, for having me here today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners. As an occupier on Meanjin, where I reside, I'd like to acknowledge elders, past and present, Yugara, Yagara and Turrbal people. I reside on Nulunpul land, and which extends down to Minjerribah. So I have very close connections throughout Meanjin and the south of Meanjin, which is otherwise known Brisbane and South Brisbane, all the way to Stradbroke Island. I'd also like to acknowledge all the women that have been criminalised and imprisoned around the world, and it's a very difficult time at the moment because of COVID. There's, some women's prisons that 80% of the women have COVID-19 tested positive, and there's women dying now inside prisons because they're not being released into the community. There's many countries that are releasing tens of thousands of people, women as well, not as many women, but men out of prison in other countries around the world. But here in Australia, no woman has been released due to COVID-19, even though there's 2 jurisdictions that actually gives the power to the Commissioner of Corrective Services in those jurisdictions. So we've been fighting since COVID in early March, when the lockdowns of prisons, to actually free women inside prisons, more so pushing bail applications through the Supreme Court and also through parole, exceptional circumstances parole. No woman, nobody actually has got exceptional circumstances parole due to COVID, and that's because corrective services say that no one has COVID in the prison system. But let's think of that in context that actually 99% of people in our prisons in this country have not been tested. So to say that they don't have COVID is actually misleading, because you actually think that if they say no one has COVID, it means no one has it. You don't think about have they been tested or not or proven negative. And as someone who's had COVID disease and I'm still testing positive now. So my symptoms started on the 10th of March. I was tested on the 14th. Told on the 15th of March that I was positive. I was released out of quarantine on the 7th of April, even though I was still testing positive, but I was told that I'm not infectious. So there's been ongoing health issues with COVID for myself and others that have had COVID, because we've actually looked at COVID in a very narrow lens that you either die or you don't. And if you don't, no one's taking any notice about what's actually happening to us that had it and our ongoing health concerns. And so my health went downhill again a couple of weeks ago. I was retested, and they thought that I might have been the first person in the country here that's got COVID a second time, but I wasn't. It's still that the traces of the COVID has not left my body, so to speak. But I was listening, Sharon, when you were talking about, women's lives and domestic violence, and I was reminded as well, the clear depiction that we see around the world at the moment, from the Black Lives Matter movement, from here, the Stop Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and we see very clearly what the state values, and the state actors are the police force. And if we can think back here, just last weekend in Sydney, there was protests about the statues of people, colonisers, the invaders of this country, who actually, their colonising policy, if you like, is genocide that continues today for First Nations people in this country. And we saw the police standing around the statue in the park, and then police on horses standing around that statue and guarding it. And we know that an Aboriginal woman could ring police because her life is threatened. They don't show up. Or if they do show up, they then check if she has warrants, and they arrest her and put her in prison. And we saw that very clearly with Miss Du, who actually then died the most horrific death on a cold concrete floor in a watch house in Western Australia. Police were called out because of domestic violence. They came, but because she had a warrant of around $3,600 for a fine that she couldn't pay because she was impoverished, they arrested her, and over 3 days, she died the most horrendous death inside that watch house. And so we know, when we look at images of statues and how the state guards them, and actually do not protect the most vulnerable women in our communities is actually appalling. And we've not just seen that here, we've seen that around the world. And just, you know, thinking of Miss Du, who died over 5 years ago, and there was an inquest, and in the inquest there was a findings to change the laws in Western Australia, as it's the only jurisdiction left that has laws that if you get a fine and you can't pay the fine, a warrant is issued immediately, or arrested, and you go directly to prison. Other jurisdictions allow you options to deal with the fines in different ways, so you actually don't go to prison, and prison is the last resort. So that, you know, the Labor government, they were in opposition at the time, and they had they got elected on a platform to change the laws. And I can say now, last night, those laws were passed in the upper house. This has taken years. It was a recommendation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Deaths in Custody 30 years ago. But here we are, 3 decades on, the laws are changed. Ms. Du did not have to die in that most horrendous way on a cold concrete floor in a watch house because she's poor if these laws were enacted 30 years ago. And I just want to acknowledge the Noongar elders and their activism for this for decades, and finally it's changed. So we ran a campaign, Free Her, and over 21,000 people had donated over a 17, it was January last year, January, February, March, April, May, June, 17-month period, where people have donated over 1.1 million for us to get women out of prison who are in there for those warrants. So we pay the warrants, or we pay the warrants that are active so that police can't arrest them, the Aboriginal women, or we assist Aboriginal women to set up payment plans because they actually do want to pay it back, but they can't afford $100 a week. They can afford $5 a week. But finally, these laws are going to be changed, and hopefully the royal assent will happen next week, and no one will be actually incarcerated for poverty again in Western Australia. So that's the win. But it's also leaves a very bad taste in my mouth, and I would absolutely know in Miss Du's family's mouths the injustice, because she would be alive today if these laws had been changed. And so, you know, these laws that we've all fought for, the Aboriginal elders, you know, and everybody else, is for Miss Du and for every other person that's died in a prison cell in Western Australia.
Thank you very much, Deb. It is, I understand, it's bittersweet. I've been feeling that with both some of the commentary around the US and Australia, in the sense of we've known what was wrong with policing and what was wrong with incarceration, and the over-policing and the socioeconomic injustice of so many of these models of justice. They're not new, they're very, very old, and they're like Dickens, something out of a Dickens novel, and we haven't been able to get the reforms to take hold. So you see this anger.
International call now around the world to defund police. The time has come to defund police. And what people will say is, what about the rapists and murderers? And I say, well, what about the rapists and murderers? What is happening with them now? Nothing. So we need to actually look at other models of justice that brings everybody safety, and the police do not bring us. I'm sitting here in my office getting text messages right now because I was dealing with some Aboriginal people now who are in the city of Brisbane protesting to stop Aboriginal deaths in custody and Aboriginal Lives Matter, who are now being arrested in the watch house. And when we're finished, I will, you know, probably have to go to the watch house and deal with those matters, whether it's with the police or the courts. But you know, the time has come that we actually have to stop funding police. We must defund them, but not transfer the money just to health services and other social services, but to actually safe frameworks that do not use carceral frameworks that continue to trap, control, imprison, and come from a position of power over on others, the most marginalised in our community, fundamentally here, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
I think there's been a lot of debate about carceral approaches to domestic and family violence as well, having unintended consequences of increasing women in custody, but also is it hearing a lot more about, a focus has got to go on the prevention of this violence, on early intervention and changing patterns of behaviour. Sharon, I want to ask you about this issue of intimate partner violence in the Pacific. As I said, there's a global discussion around whether the lockdown policies were designed well enough to deal with the corresponding impact on domestic violence that should have been predictable, and made it very difficult for boys and girls, men and women, to talk about what was happening or to seek help. And we know in this economic recovery period that a lot of the fiscal stimulus packages or economic downturn issues might again close refuges, close responses to domestic violence. So I want to ask you about the Pacific, and I want to come back to you on the climate change issue too. This issue of, it was the same in Australia. We had those terrible bushfires right before the pandemic hit us. And, many of those people who were affected by bushfires got hit straight away by COVID as well. It's not happening on its own. It's happening in a context of cascading issues. And that's what we're going to see in the new era of climate change. We're going to see cascading issues. So, sorry, two issues for you there. First, domestic violence in the Pacific, and second, this issue of what do we do with these cascading issues that are affecting us?
So I think first and foremost, we do need to acknowledge, and there is political acknowledgement of the high rates of violence against women, sexual gender-based violence across our Pacific Island region. And so it's really, it is a worry that when a humanitarian response is being designed, we do have, within the humanitarian cluster system, this protection cluster that everyone gets activated. We're talking about protection, but it's not being mainstreamed across all the other parts of the response as well. It's almost like, oh yes, it happens. So when you're starting to see the spikes, because there's going to be increased reporting by women and children who have access or the means to report this, then there is a sudden sort of running around and saying, okay, what do we do? So I think it's going to be critical for the humanitarian system in our part of the world, but also across the globe, because it is a global system, that protection is critical, but not just the means of the how to protect, but also, as you said, how do we also ensure that the humanitarian system, from the early response to the longer term recovery, is actually driving or addressing the drivers of violence. So it comes back to my first point about what are women's notions of security? How do we actually ensure that the economic system that is going to be agreed upon in terms of this recovery package is actually going to ensure that there is better security, there is better resourcing also for what women have been asking for in my country, at least of Fiji, for better community policing. Where are those resources going to be? And so, I think it's a really important time that we talk about, security sector governance, because people don't like to talk about security sector reform, but this is it, I think it's also important that we take into account as a lesson learned, and once again, in conversation with rural women in the past week here in the northern part of Fiji, was how responses are organized. Yes, we understand that there had to be certain health protocols, but where we have communities living in settlements, in traditional villages as well, could we have taken the approach of ensuring greater conversation and dialogue, using the peace-building methodology of dialogue and mediation to determine what is going to really be needed in terms of the safety and protection for women and children. So in the second point about, what happens in disaster management, it happens again when it comes to disaster preparedness. You don't hear the messages about we've got to ensure the safety and protection of women of all diversities, of persons with disabilities, of children. It always seems to be an afterthought. So I think this is an important global moment that we really talk about as feminists, as women's human rights defenders. We've got to change it. We've got to make sure that all of the commitments through the treaty bodies, through regional policy commitments, to national level policy, national budgets, the way in which the community security is organized is really organized in a manner in which we are taking into account, at least for our Pacific region, but in other countries where there are traditional indigenous systems, how could security be organized in a way that people don't feel like they're in this kind of weird, oppressive lockdown? I think even the word lockdown you almost want to naturally rebel against it, because you're being told you're putting in, you're being locked down, and you're being told there's this curfew being imposed, et cetera, et cetera. So it comes back also to our communication systems. It's also about the way in which our leaders also are talking to the communities and engaging in a way that also opens them up to being willing to either be challenged or to listen to different ideas. And within that, those kinds of processes, the platform is there through the Women, Peace and Security agenda to really help guide them. But I think if we have if we continue along this path, we are certainly getting ourselves more entrenched in the kind of hard security, military posturing, and all things associated with it around our human rights as well. Because you can also then say, because of COVID-19, you can't gather to have a conversation. You start to actually impose rules and regulations, not just on socialization, but community conversations, which are just so critical.
That's right. It has been hopeful to see creative protests and creative ways of staying as part of a community, but that's what I've seen, this kind of women's organisations really struggling to maintain the momentum they had before the pandemic. And I suppose I want to ask you all to give me some closing remarks. I just want to reflect, I guess, on this idea of a lot of what you're saying is that a lot of our institutions have not been fit for purpose for women's lived experience anyway before the pandemic, and maybe the pandemic has made it even clearer. Many institutionalized places, prisons, elder, aged care homes, refugee camps. There are many places in the world where we knew there were systematic and structural problems, and they have just been even more illuminated by what's happening. So building trust, deinstitutionalizing people where we can, and thinking more about how to build the lived experience of women into these restrictions, and trying not to continually securitize our responses to things that happen, because you can see with climate change coming upon us, there is a very authoritarian way to deal with climate change, and then there is a community adaptation and resilience pathway, and you can sort of see that we're going more that way than that way. It's very nerve-wracking. I'm going to come back to you, Sharon, and to you, Deb. Deb first, give us in terms of reaching out to women around the world as part of this global conversation, what message do you want to give to the other women of the world around, how to improve our human rights after this pandemic?
Yeah, well, I'm sitting here listening to Sharon and just thinking, racial capitalism has fundamentally failed us all, environmentally, politically, economically. And until we actually understand that, and I think we are during this pandemic because it's failed us. And if we think of the pandemic, there's not enough ventilators in the world that hospitals have, because the health system has fundamentally been privatized around the world. And so, corporations decide that we need one ventilator, not 100 ventilators, and then we have a crisis like this. This is what happens. We don't fund services for our environment, so when we have fires, they're out of control. We don't take any notice of First Nations people about who's been looking after the land for 60,000 years. women, the most marginalised women, are being cut off from their communities and communication. And it's about trying to find new ways to have conversations and communication. So giving women the resources, even if it's a phone, a computer, something that they can have conversations like us on Zoom. It's so important, you know, like I think of, you know, the women in prison across this country, around the world in prisons that don't have access, can't have access, that where they have to pay for phone calls to ring their children and families. And if they don't have money, you know, they've got to make a choice, buy soap, because that's what we're told to do, wash our hands, or use your money to ring your children. Well, I'm in prison. I know I'd be spending the money to ring my children, and that's what women do. So their lives are at risk. So we just need to keep pushing ahead. We need to be able to reflect now, which we can over the last 3 months, 6 months of the pandemic, of what's working well and what's collapsing in the racial capitalist world, and to move that forward. You know, when people say, it'll be good to get back to normal, I always say normal is a spin cycle on the washing machine, and I don't necessarily want to go back there. So we need to move forward.
That's great. Thank you, Deb. Sharon, last words for you.
Well, for me, I've been talking for the last couple of years about redesigning the table. You know, when we talk about women, peace and security, and, you know, traditionally peace building, we've had to ask for a space at the table. But I think it's now time to redefine the table as well. So we need a table where we can all meet. Traditionally, we have spoken about bringing women to the table, which includes supporting our networks, resourcing our networks to be able to bring the range of issues that we represent. It's not just about one woman. We need to do that because the concern around the securitization of climate change, the securitization of humanitarian response, the shift, even though there is a human security commitment in our region, there's a shift to militarize human security is of a concern. So I think what's really important is to continue to think about how we can redefine the table to no longer just disregard women's action and women's voice. So we need to redefine the table going forward in light of COVID-19. So we're getting better at addressing the peace, development, and humanitarian nexus. Because what COVID has taught us in the response is we've been talking about climate change, we've been talking about resilience, we've been talking about human security, we've been talking about peace building, and every now and then we talk about this humanitarian response. We now need to be talking about it all together. So it means a redefining of the roles of all the different actors. It requires even the UN system to start to rethink how their structures and systems are going to be supporting women, and that we shouldn't have to be validating or having to demonstrate who our networks are, etc., because we come with our constituency. And so it's really about that, it's time to really shift the power. And the power also means listening to us as women of the world to hear and to act on what we say is our security, whether it's in our traditional villages, whether it's in our schools, whether it's in our neighborhood or in our own homes. So I think this is the time, and we really have to reshape the security agenda.
Thank you so much. And a very happy woof at the end there, which I liked as well. Look, thank you both so much. That there's so much food for thought. Thank you for helping us bring this voice of the Asia Pacific to this global conversation. So for Sharon Bagran-Rolls and Debbie Kilroy, thank you very much. My name's Susan Harris-Wimmera. We have been delighted to join you